Okay, hello. Good morning. Good morning. Today we are going to be reading Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela White Davis. We started reading it yesterday morning, and it was an excellent book about intersectionality and different things of that nature. Let's take this drink beforehand. Coming to you live from Say Name Square. This is at the corner of East State and First Street. This is a memorial for Mike Sago, for little Mike Sago, who was 16 years old when he was murdered at Marie's Pizza by off-duty officer Frank Pobjecki. Him and his half-brother, him and his brother Lamar Coates and Brandon Sago, his cousin, and Desmond Bellman were each shot by Officer Frank Pobjecki. And this is done, it's going to happen throughout the readings. Just going to be set up at different memorial spots. So this is just done in an effort to raise awareness and to familiarize people with this name, what happened to him, and his face. Okay, so we're going to continue on reading. We are on chapter 3. That's where we stop. And the format of this book is a little odd. Not odd, but a little different than anything I've read before. It's in a interview format. It's done in an interview format by Frank. I should have looked up how to pronounce his name, but I'm going to say Frank Barrett. This interview was conducted in December 10th, 2014. Chapter 3 is called We Have to Talk About Systemic Change. Okay, and then the first part start off with the interview with Frank. Frank say, "The last time we spoke about Ferguson, the crime had happened, but the grand jury had not given its verdict yet. Following the death of another black man, Eric Garner, at the hands of the police, I'd like to talk about it again. 2 black men died, and the cops are walking free. What needs to change?" Then Angela's response to this question is, my fault, I should have said this. Let me know if the audio need to be changed at all, if the audio choppy or something. Let me know. First, I would point out that this is Angela's response. First, I would point out that police killings of black men and women are not unusual. That's right. Robin D.G. Kelly wrote an article recently which you might find interesting. You can find it on the Portside website. The name of the article is Why We Won't Wait. The article lists all the black people who have been killed by the police while we were waiting to hear the results of the Ferguson verdict. So this just makes me think about how much. First thing I want to say is police here in Winnebago County, on average, they shoot or in some way attempt to kill, use deadly force 2 times per year here in Winnebago County. So it is not an unusual thing. And the people that they do shoot, they do use deadly force upon, the vast majority is black people and people of color. So when she say that the police killing of black men and women are not unusual, it is not unusual here in Rockford. But this part made me think about is Ma'Khia Bryant. How a lot of people try to use this George Floyd, the Derek Chauvin being found guilty on all accounts of murdering George Floyd, and a lot of people use it as a celebration moment while it was Ma'Khia Bryant was being murdered, while other people across the country were being murdered by the police. And just a few times after that, it was police shootings here. Okay. So the interviewer asked, "These killings all took place in a couple months?" And Angela say, "Exactly. During the time the grand jury was in session, listening to evidence. I think that we often treat these cases as if they were exceptions, as if they were aberrations, whereas in actuality, they happen all the time. And we assume that if we are only able to punish the perpetrator, then justice will have been done. But as a matter of fact, as horrendous as it was, that the grand jury refused to indict 2 police officers for the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Had they indicted the officers, I don't know whether anything would have changed. I'm making this point in order to emphasize that even when police are indicted, we cannot be certain that change is on the agenda." There is a case in North Carolina, I believe, involving a young man by the name of Jonathan Farrell, who was killed by the police after he had an accident with his automobile and attempted to get help by knocking on someone's door. The person apparently claimed that he might have been a burglar and called the police, who immediately killed him. Now, in that case, the policeman was not initially indicted. However, the prosecutor persisted, and eventually the grand jury did indict him. I guess the point I'm making is, we have to talk about systemic change. We cannot be content with individual actions. And so that means a whole range of things. That means reconceptualizing the role that police play. That means perhaps establishing community control of the police. Not simply a review of actions in the aftermath of a crime by the police, but community bodies that have the power to actually control and dictate the actions of the police. That means addressing racism in the larger sense. It means also looking at the ways in which police are encouraged to use violence as a first resort, and the connection between the institutionalized violence and other modes of violence. In relation to Ferguson especially, it means demilitarization of the police as a demand that needs to be taken up all over the country. So the interviewer say, "So we are talking about a systemic change, right?" And Angela responds, "Exactly." Interviewer Frank say, "Deep down in the system, yes, absolutely." Then Frank say, "You mentioned this black man whose car had broken down, looking for help. And the people pretty much straight away thought he was a burglar or something. Do you think this has to do with stereotypes? The way that society and media portray black people as potentially dangerous, potentially criminal, creating this image in people's mind, creating prejudice?" The Angela response is, "Yes, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, these stereotypes have been functioning since the era of slavery. Frederick Douglass wrote about the tendency to impute crime to color. He pointed out that a white man in blackface committed a whole range of crimes because he knew well that he would not be suspected by virtue that he was white. On the other hand, all black people were subject to the ideological link between blackness and criminalization. Racism, as it has evolved in the history of the United States, has always involved a measure of criminalization, so that it is not difficult to understand how stereotypical assumptions about black people being criminals persist to this day. Racial profiling is an example. The fact that driving while black can be dangerous. And again, whenever something like this gets stated or whatever, something like this comes up, I do find it necessary, maybe not necessary, but always a good thing to remind folks about that you are 3 times more likely to be pulled over in Rockford just by being black. Just by being black in Rockford, that make you 3 times more likely to get pulled over. Recently, one of the trending Twitter conversations had to do with criming while white. A whole number of white people wrote in and described crimes they had committed for which they were never suspected. And one person pointed out that he and a black friend were arrested by the police for stealing a candy bar. The cop gave the white person the candy bar, and the black person was eventually sentenced to prison. Wow. Wow. The cop gave the white person the candy bar, and the black person was eventually sentenced to prison. And Frank say, this is true everywhere in a way. There is profiling in Paris too. If you talk to someone who is of Algerian descent in Paris, they face pretty much the same stereotypes and fabrications as African Americans in the USA. Why do you think those stereotypes are fabricated? Is it a case of divide and rule strategy? The Angela response to this is, racism is a very complex phenomenon. There are very important structural elements of racism. It's often those structural elements that aren't taken into consideration when there is discussion about ending racism or challenging racism. There's also the impact on the psyche, and this is where the persistence of stereotypes come in. The way in which, over a period of decades and centuries, black people have been dehumanized, that is to say, represented as less than human. And so, the representational politics that one sees through the media, that one sees in other modes of communication that come into play in social interactions have equated black with criminal. And so it is not difficult to understand how long they have persisted. The question is why there has not been, up until now, a serious effort to understand the impact of racism on institutions and on individual attitudes. Until we are able to address racism in that kind of comprehensive way, the stereotypes will persist. Then the interviewer say, what about Obama? He didn't visit Ferguson, not yet anyway. How does he fit in the political picture at the moment? Then Angela response is, well, I think that one of a number of explanations for the rise of a very interesting foundation for a movement against racism and racist violence and police violence we are witnessing at the moment has to do with the fact that the election of Obama was hailed as a possible beginning of a so-called post-racial era. Of course, it didn't make a great deal of sense that the election of one person could transform the impact of racism on institutions and attitudes of an entire country. But I do think that the fact that there is now a sitting black president renders the racist violence that people have witnessed, renders that violence more impactful. And no, Obama did not visit Ferguson. Eric Holder did, the Attorney General, and as critical as I may be of that administration, I think that it was important that Eric Holder pointed out, at least early on, that the militarization of the police was an important issue. Initially in Ferguson, we saw the military garb, the military equipment. Interestingly enough, during the last period, we haven't had visual images that emphasize the fact that police have been the recipients of military garb, weaponry, technology, etc. Anyway, I don't think we can rely on governments, regardless of who's in power, to do the work that only mass movements can do. I think what is most important about the sustained demonstrations that are happening now is that they are having the effort of refusing to allow these issues to die. Then Frank say, you mentioned that one person would not change the whole system. So how is Obama constrained by the system that actually got him elected? And Angela's response is, well, of course, there is a whole apparatus that controls the presidency that is absolutely resistant to change, which isn't to excuse Obama from taking bolder steps. I think there are steps that he could have taken had he insisted. But if one looks at the history of struggles against racism in the U.S., no change has ever happened simply because the president chose to move in a more progressive direction. Every change that has happened has come out as a result of mass movements, from the era of slavery, the Civil War, and the involvement of black people in the Civil War, which really determined the outcome. Many people were under the impression it was Abraham Lincoln who played the major role, and he did, as a matter of fact, help to accelerate the movement toward abolition. But it was the decision on the part of the slaves to emancipate themselves and to join the Union Army, both women and men. That was primarily responsible for the victory over slavery. It was the slaves themselves, and of course, the abolitionist movement that led to the dismantling of slavery. When one looks at the Civil Rights era, it was those mass movements, anchored by women, incidentally, that pushed the government to bring about change. I don't see why things would be any different today. Then Frank say, so do you think Ferguson can be the catalyst for a new movement? Could this be the tipping point? Then Angela responds, I do think that movements require time to develop and mature. They don't happen spontaneously. They occur as a result of organizing and hard work that most often happens behind the scenes. Over the last 2 decades, I would say, there has been sustained organizing against police violence, racism, racist police violence, against prisons, the prison industrial complex. And I think that the sustained protests we are seeing now have a great deal to do with that organizing. They reflect the fact that the political consciousness in so many communities is so much higher than people think. that there is a popular understanding of the connection between racist police violence and systemic issues. The prison industrial complex has something to do with the CIA's use of secret prisons and the torture that was recently revealed. So I think that we have a foundation for a movement. I won't say that there exists an organized movement because we haven't reached that point yet. But there is a powerful foundation, and people are ready for a movement. And Frank say, the interviewer say, talking about the prison industrial complex and the prison abolition movement in the U.S., what can movements nowadays accomplish? What lessons did we learn from the 60s and 70s? Then Angela response is, well, I think we learned in the 60s and 70s that mass movements can indeed bring about systemic change. If one looks at all of the legislation that was passed, the Civil Rights Act, for example, the Voting Rights Act, that didn't happen as a result of a president taking extraordinary steps. It happened as a result of people marching and organizing. I can remember that in 1963, during the Civil Rights era, before the March on Washington that summer, in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a children's crusade. Children were organized to face the high power fire hoses and the police. Bull Connors police in Birmingham. Of course, there were some who disagreed with allowing children to participate at that level. Even Malcolm X thought it was not appropriate to expose children to that amount of danger. But it was the children that wanted to participate. And the images of children facing police dogs and fire hoses circulated all over the world, and that it helped to create a global consciousness of the brutality of racism. It was an extraordinary step. And this is something that is often forgotten. The role that children actually played in breaking the stronghold of silence regarding racism. So I guess during the 60s and 70s, we did really learn that change was possible. Not ultimately the kind of change we really wanted. I shouldn't put it that way. I should say not enough change, because change did occur within the sphere of law, which was extremely important. But we did not experience the economic changes and the other mode of structural change that we will need in order to root out racism. And the next question is, that's the thing. How can movements pressure even the most reluctant politicians? Angela's response was, well, Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a president during that era, he was a reluctant Southerner politician who clearly assented to racism. But it was under his administration that important laws were passed. So I think movements can indeed force reluctant politicians to take steps. If one looks at the example of South Africa, who would have ever believed that is that de Klerk? Who would ever believe that de Klerk would take the position he ended up taking? That was because of the movements within South Africa, the South African movement outside of South Africa, and also the Global Solidarity Campaign. The interviewer say, staying on the U.S. side, what's the future of black politics? And Angela say, well, I don't know whether Obama played a major role in developing the future of black politics within the U.S. But I think the real question is about the future of anti-racist politics. Then Frank say, you touched on it before. The fact that Obama was elected maybe actually was a block somehow. Then Angela say, actually, I think it's important to conceptualize black politics in a broader framework now. We can't think about We can't think about black politics in the same way that we once thought about it. What I would say is that in many ways, the black struggle in the U.S. serves as an emblem of the struggle for freedom. It's emblematic of larger struggles for freedom. So within the sphere of black politics, I would also have to include gender struggles, struggles against homophobia, and I would also have to include struggles against the repressive immigration policies. I think that's important to point to what is often called the black radical tradition. The black radical tradition is related not simply to black people, but to all people who are struggling for freedom. So, the future in that respect, I think, has to be considered open. Certainly, black freedom in the narrow sense has not yet been won, particularly considering the fact that huge numbers of black people are below the poverty line. Considering the fact that a hugely disproportionate number of black people are now in prison, caught in the web of the prison industrial complex. But at the same time, we have to look at the Latino population, and we have to look at the indigenous population, Native Americans people. And we have to look at the way in which anti-Muslim racism has really thrived on the foundation of anti-black racism. So it's far more complicated now, and I would never argue that it's possible to look at black freedom in a narrow sense. And particularly, given the fact that we have the emergence of a black middle class, the fact that Obama is president is emblematic of the rise of black individuals, not only within politics, but also within the economic hierarchies. And that is not going to necessarily transform the condition of the majority of black people. Excuse me. Then the interviewer, Frank, say, I think that's very interesting. I'm not sure how to put it, but do you think that when a group of people, and I mean the example of South Africa is telling as well, but if a group of people gets to a high place in terms of politics or business, money, my fault, let me start this over. I think that's very interesting. And I'm not sure how to put it, but do you think that when a group of people get into high places in terms of politics or business, that money then comes before blackness or the facts of being Native American? And then he said, I was in Chile recently, and the Palestinian community in Chile is one of the largest in the world. And Angela say, oh, I didn't know that. Then the Frank continued, while I was giving lectures there, I visited Villa Grimaldi, where many people were tortured and killed. People told me about 60% of the Palestinian community there. My fault. People tell me about 60% of the Palestinian community there, which is one of the wealthiest in the world as well, supported, is that Pinochet? Pinochet, I don't know, during the regime. Not because he tortured and killed people, but because they were a neoliberal. They were interested in keeping their wealth and privilege. So before condemning the torture, they were looking at their wallets. That same happened in South Africa. That made me, it's that little line right there. So before condemning the torture, they were looking at their wallets. That, just a little line, just a little sentence, that made me think of Sydney Market, and that made me think of Tom McNamara and Kyle Saunders and Todd Cagnoni and Shirelli down there and some of those board members down there. Of how it's been city officials that have regularly weaponized the police on the occupation outside here. It's been city market organizers like Kathy McDermott and Peter Provenzano who have regularly weaponized the police on protests down there. It's been Winnebago County board members and politicians who have regularly okayed and allowed the Winnebago County sheriffs to enact violence on protesters. It's been people like Cabello, who was a politician at the time, organized Back the Blue campaigns, and to where people got attacked and mauled right outside the jail on August 1st last year. So it's been people at City Market, the City Market organizers, where their pocket's the most important thing to them. Their wallet's the most important thing to them. So anything that could possibly and potentially mess with their money has to go. It has to be done by any means necessary. Anything that messes with Kathy McDermott's money, anything that messes with Peter Provenzano's money, that it has to be taken care of. It has to be solved. It has to be gotten rid of. And it don't matter that a 12-year-old girl was pepper sprayed. It don't matter that people were brutally arrested. It don't matter that people still got injuries to this day from arrests that took place. It don't matter that it was 33 people that was arrested last year during City Market. It don't matter. Because it all might have messed up Kathy McDermott's pockets. It all might have messed up the City Market organizers' pockets. And the same thing happened here with Tom. He cared more about his image and he cared more about his pockets as well than to care enough about faces like this, to care about memorials like this of people who have been killed by the police, to where he has gone to a place where he has regularly weaponized the police. On October 5th of last year, it was 6 arrests made. A cop choked me in the flower bed back there behind City Hall. Another cop slammed a black woman on the ground, slammed her head against a pole, and just the whole nature of her arrest was entirely unnecessary, entirely excessive, and entirely brutal. But because the protests out here and people speaking out about these issues, speaking out about people being shot by the police, speaking out about the brutal nature of arrest, speaking out about the issues and the problems that the city has enacted for the entire time it's been a city. And Tom has to do everything in his power to get rid of that, because it might mess up his pockets, it might mess up his money, it might mess up his image or the next election that he comes about. So it don't matter to Tom, it don't matter to Todd, it don't matter to Kyle that people were choked out, people were choked back there, that black woman had her head swung up against a pole, that people had been regularly arrested here. Not regularly arrested here, but people have been arrested here. All because, and that's the same type of thing that people say with riots, that people value profit over people, that people value buildings over people. People was mad. Until this day, people pull up when we down there, people pull up and they sometimes they see the photo of Denzel and they ask, oh, was that, he got beat up during the riots? He got beat up during the riot. That's a first question. That's a first thought process. Oh, the riots downtown. And no, that was a regular day. That was just a regular day for police officers. And plus, there was no riots, really. There wasn't no riots. It's people will, I don't know. People will always be more valuable than profit. It don't matter how much in your wallet, it's always people more valuable. Because you can't put a price on this. You can't. You can't put a price on this. 16 years old. 16 years old. You can't put a price on this. My fault. Angela's response to this question is, it's all very complicated, and particularly during this era of global capitalism and neoliberalism. In South Africa, the rise of a very powerful and very affluent In South Africa, the rise of a very powerful and very affluent black sector of the population, the potential for which was never really taken into account, at least not publicly, during the struggle during apartheid. It was assumed that once black people achieved political and economic power, there would be economic freedom for everyone. And we see that's not necessarily the case. We have basically the same situation in the U.S. I've been actually visiting Brazil frequently for the last period, and Brazil is now on the cusp of some major breakthroughs within respect to racism. I think that they have the opportunity to choose whether to follow the example of the U.S. and South Africa. So it surprises me that Palestinians would have been supportive of him. But I don't find it entirely unbelievable. Then the interviewer say, not all of them, right? So then Angela responds, no, you said 60%, which is substantial. And I think it's extremely important that over the last period, we've seen the development of solidarity campaigns that have brought out different struggles together. Palestinians who have been inspired by black struggles in the U.S. should inspire black people to continue the struggle for freedom. But, on the other hand, Palestinians, perhaps, can look at the problems inherent in the assumptions. Let me start that over. But on the other hand, Palestinians, perhaps, can look at the problems inherent in the assumption that the rise of individual black people to power can, in fact, change the whole system, the whole situation. What is going to lead to freedom for the Palestinian people is going to be a lot more complicated than money. So the next question, how you doing? The next interview section is, what can black feminism and the black struggle offer to the Palestinian movement? Then Angela say, I don't know whether I would phrase the question in that way, because I think solidarity also implies a kind of mutuality. Given the fact that in the U.S., we're already encouraged to assume that we have the best of everything, the U.S. exceptionalism puts us in a situation as activists to offer advice to people struggling all over the world. And I don't agree with that. I think we share our experiences, just as I think the development of black feminism and women of color feminism can offer ideas, experiences, and analysis to Palestinians. So can black feminism and women of color feminism women of color feminism learn from the struggle of the Palestinian people and Palestinian feminists. So I think the whole notion of intersectionality that has characterized the kind of feminisms we're talking about, that we cannot simply look at gender in isolation from race, from class, from sexuality, from nationality, from mobility, from a whole range of other issues that Palestinians, or perhaps in the Palestinian struggle, have given expression to that and have actually helped people in the U.S. image broader notions of intersectionality. And the interviewer question is, how has the Palestine struggle changed in the U.S. over the last several years? The Angela say, I feel some important changes have occurred. For far too long, the issues of Palestinian freedom has been marginalized. So much so that many people in the U.S. have been progressive, except for Palestine. And I take this from Rebecca Vilcomerson. I'm gonna go Rebecca Vilcomerson, who talk about PEPs, progressives, except Palestine. Now this is changing. The impact of the influence of Zionism, which used to be pervasive, is losing its force. On college campuses, all college and university campuses, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, has really grown, and large numbers of people who are not necessarily Palestinian, who are not necessarily Arab or Muslim, have become active in SJP groups. It is increasingly becoming that is to say, the issue of Palestine is increasingly becoming incorporated into major social justice issues. And my own personal experience has been that in the past, I could always expect resistance or challenges when talking about Palestine. But now, this is becoming increasingly acceptable. And I think this has to do with what is happening in Palestine itself. It has to do with the rise of Palestine solidarity movements all over the world, not just in the U.S. It has to do specifically in the U.S. with increasing numbers of people associated with Black and Native American and Latino movements incorporating Palestine into the agenda. I think I spoke in the last interview about the tweets of Palestinian activists used to provide advice for my fault, let me start that sentence over. I think I spoke in the last interview about the tweets of Palestinian activists used to provide advice for protesters in Ferguson on how to deal with tear gas, so that direct connections has been facilitated by social media has been important as well. Excuse me. Then Frank the interviewer say, I was in, Sevilla? For a conference, and Raheem Kura from SJP UCLA, which you know well, was there with me. And I told them I was going to meet you, and he had an interesting question for you in terms of student activism. He asked, what is the role of student activism today? And how should students think about the relationship to the broader community and the movements that surround campuses, particularly in a time where universities are becoming increasingly elite institutions? Then Angela's response is, Certainly. And historically, UCLA has been the center of a whole number of struggles that are linked to the community. I can mention my own struggle at UCLA. But but I think now students who challenge the borders of the university and attempt to establish universities as a stronghold of neoliberalism, my fault. Let me start this up. In the attempt to establish universities as a stronghold of neoliberal elitism, those challenges are extremely important. With the case of SJP rather, linking campuses to BDS all over the country has not only had the effect of strengthening the BDS movement, but has opened up possibilities for students to challenge prison privatization. And of course, on many of the campuses where there have been efforts to develop resolutions against corporations. Okay, here we go. What is this? And of course, on many of the campuses where there have been efforts to develop resolutions against corporations that profit from the occupation of Palestine, there have also been struggles for resolutions against companies that profit from prison privatization. So I think that these two are in a way symbiotically connected. And that's one example of many. Frank say, in terms of Palestine, again in the U.S., how are the narratives similar or different from the apartheid days? From the anti-apartheid days? Oh, get out of here. No. Oh. Okay. There are a lot of similarities, precisely because BDS has chosen to follow the route of the anti-apartheid struggle toward a hopefully more global sense of solidarity by using the method of mass boycott. But I guess what is different is the existence of a powerful Zionist lobby. Certainly, there was a powerful apartheid lobby. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I apologize. Excuse me. Certainly there was a powerful apartheid lobby, but it did not have nearly the influence as the Zionist lobby, which can be seen in terms of black religion. Its tentacles reach into the black church. There have been direct efforts on the part of the state of Israel to recruit significant black figures. And I don't know whether we've experienced that level of sophistication during the anti-apartheid era. Certainly, the Israeli state has learned from the movement. But at the same time, I think that we've never seen, on a grassroots level, the kind of affinity with the struggle. Let me set that up on my phone. But at the same time, I think that we've never seen, on a grassroots level, the kind of affinity with the struggle in Palestine as we are witnessing today among activist groups. And my experience has been whereas once one would have expected perhaps restrained enthusiasm for the Palestinian struggle, now one can expect that audiences everywhere embrace the struggle. The American Studies Association passed on an important resolution on Palestine solidarity. Recently, I had the opportunity to participate on a panel of the National Women's Studies Association, NWSA. And the NWSA has taken a position on Palestine. My fault. My fault. I would say, not my fault. Okay. In a large gathering with perhaps 2,500 people during a panel on Palestine, someone asked whether we could take a floor vote, whether people there wanted the NWSA to take a strong position in support of BDS. And virtually everyone in the audience stood up. This was so unprecedented. There may have been 10 or 20 people sitting down, but the sustained applause was actually very exciting to experience. These changes are crucial to bring about a bigger one. I think about MESA as well. The Middle East Studies Association has recently endorsed the BDS call. And Frank said, Frank say, even Israeli academics said this was a major change. So the response is, let's remember that it was the Asian American Studies Association that first passed a resolution, and then the American Studies Association that followed. And now, of course, then Frank say MESA and then Angela's response and Critical Ethnic Studies Association. Quite a number of academic organizations. And Frank say, so it's all great, but in your opinion, what can we do to strengthen the pro-justice movement even more? I've never heard. The pro-justice movement. I don't know. That's nuts. The pro-justice movement. I was like, I don't know if I like that term or not, like that phrase or not. Because it would be nuts. It would be nuts if somebody say, oh, I'm part of the anti-justice movement. That would be nuts. That would be. And some people do say that in not so many words, but, linguistics are funny. Linguistics are important. Okay, I'm gonna read the whole question over. So it's all great, but in your opinion, what can we do to strengthen the pro-justice movement even more in the U.S.? And the same question applies to the whole world, I think. And Angela's response is, well, I think that we are constantly having to make connections so that when we are engaged in the struggle against racist violence in relation to Ferguson, Michael Brown, and New York, Eric Garner, we cannot forget the connection with Palestine. So, in many ways, I think we have to engage in an exercise of intersectionality, of always foregrounding these connections so that people remember that nothing happens in isolation. That when we see the police repressing protests in Ferguson, we also have to think about the Israeli police and the Israeli army repressing protests in the occupied Palestine. Then Frank say, the interviewer, let's say, Bugs. These bugs are nuts. Only one of the probably the worst part about summer. We talked about the militarization of the police. You see it in Ferguson. You also see it. My fault. You see it in Ferguson. You also see it in the West Bank, in Gaza. You also see it in Athens, in Greece, right now. Police forces looking like RoboCops. The fact that this is a global struggle becomes more obvious when you make those connections. Then Angela say, because they're shrewd. So we no longer see it in Ferguson because they have decided to make their militarization less visible. But even when we can't see it, we have to make the point. And I think that's perhaps even more important, that people learn to see it through the efforts to render those military influence. It was my fault. Let me start this over. And I think that's perhaps even more important, that people learn to see it through the efforts to render those military influences invisible. And just talking about the militarization of the police. In the video yesterday, the reading yesterday, I talked about the militarization of the police on May 30th of last year. But on May 30th of this year, May 30th, 2021, we as a May 30th Alliance created an event at Haskell. And the event was just played some videos of what happened on last year, May 30th. There were some talks. There was some food. That was food and just a community event. But in a community event to bring awareness and to have discussions about what happened on May 30th last year. And on what the police did, the Rockford Police Department did, is they put snow fencing all up around District 1. I don't know if you drove past District 1 on that day or not. If you was wondering what the snow fencing was for, it was nuts to see. It was nuts to see. There's some photos of it. I don't know if they've really been posted or circulated right here, but it was nuts to see that. And we didn't even go to D1 or nothing like that. They did this preemptively. They did this on their own. It was nuts to see that it's just snow fencing all the way around, and they put some type of wrap on the sign, some type of like plastic covering. I don't know. The whole thing was nuts. But there was a video, and in the back lot, there was a whole bunch of police cars, no more than there normally is, and it was already them people dressed in green, who we saw terrorize people last year on May 30th, 2020, and during Black the Blue, and during different incidents like that. So just to know that just by creating this event to bring awareness of the police terrorism that took place on May 30th of last year, just by creating this event to remind people of those acts and the people that was assaulted and the people that was brutalized at the hands of the police, is that the police, nothing changed. They was ready to do it all over again. They was ready to do it all over again. They was already dressed for it. It was already dressed for it. I'm gonna make sure there's some videos or some photos of the snow fencing that get posted sometime today, because that shit was nuts that they did that though. I'm gonna make sure. Okay. So we're gonna continue reading. Chapter 3, a long one. What's about to end? Let's see. Where were we? Okay, right here. Frank say, the interviewer say, talking about connections. Do you see a role for yourself in connecting anti-racist movements in the Arab world with black consciousness and liberation movements in the US? Then Angela's response is, well, I don't know whether I would talk about a specific role for myself, an individual role, but certainly I would see myself participating in the efforts to make those connections, to render those connections more palatable and more visible. Oftentimes we learn from movements. That happens at the grassroots level, and we should be very careful not to assume that these insights. Let me wait for this. And we should be very careful not to assume that these insights belong to ourselves as individuals, or at least as more visible figures. But we have to recognize that we have learned from those moments, and we want to share those insights. That is a role I would see myself playing. Then Frank say, again, talking about black feminism, what positive developments are you seeing in black feminism in the United States? Angela say, well, the embracing of the cause of Palestinian solidarity is really important. Beverly Guy Sheftall, who is a very important figure in the development of black feminism, who teaches at Spelman College, which is one of the historically black education institutions. Howard Zinn taught there, is what the interviewer say. And Angela said, yes, he did. Alice Walker attended Spelman. It's a small women's college, but it is really important. And Beverly Guy Sheftall was a member of the same delegation that I joined to Palestine. It was an indigenous and feminist of color scholar activist delegation to Palestine. And Beverly is a very important figure who is so modest that she never claims any space for herself. But I would like to emphasize the importance of the role that she has played. Spelman College, which is a predominantly black institution, has an SJP chapter, which is the only SJP chapter on a HBCU, and I think they're giving leadership to the other historically black colleges and universities. So I think we can hope to see a great deal in the future. Beverly has been really consistent and persistent in the foregrounding the Palestinian movement. Then Frank say, the interviewer say, have you seen the consolidation of feminism in your lifetime that has effectively challenged both patriarchy and white privileged liberal feminism, if we can call it that? Then Angela's response is, I think that movements, feminist movements, other movements, are most powerful when they begin to affect the vision and perspective of those who do not necessarily associate themselves within those movements. Let me read that again. I think that movements, feminist movements, other movements, are most powerful when they begin to affect the vision and perspective of those who do not necessarily associate themselves with those movements. So that the radical feminisms or radical anti-racist feminisms are important in the sense that are important in the sense that they have affected the way young people. My fault. The car pulled up was nuts. I thought something was about to go down. So that the radical feminisms or radical anti-racist feminisms are important in the sense that they have affected the way, especially young people, think about social justice struggles today. That we cannot assume that it is possible to be victorious in any anti-racist movement as long as we do not consider how gender figures in, how gender and sexuality and class and nationality figure into these struggles. It used to be the case that the struggles for freedom were seen to be male struggles. Freedom for black people was equivalent to freedom for the black man. And if one looks at Malcolm X and many other figures, you see this constantly. And now this is no longer possible. I think that feminism is not an approach that is or should be emphasized, or should be embraced rather, simply by women. But increasingly, it has to be an approach embraced by people of all genders. Then Frank say, in terms of change, what is the most significant change in black politics since the end of the civil rights movement? Is it related to black feminism as well? Then Angela's response is, well, I think the interconnectedness of anti-racist movements with gender is crucial. But we also need to deal with this class, nationality, and ethnicity. I don't think that we can imagine black movements in the same way today as we once did. The assumption that black freedom was freedom for the black man created a certain kind of border around the black struggle, which can no longer exist. So I think that the black radical tradition has to embrace the struggles against anti-Muslim races, which is perhaps the most extreme form of racism today. It makes no sense to imagine eradicating anti-black racism without also eradicating anti-Muslim racism. So then Frank go on to say, can there be policing and imprisonment in the U.S. without racism? Then Angela's response to this question is, at this moment in the history of the U.S., I don't think that there can be policing without racism. I do not think that the criminal justice system can operate without racism. Which is to say, that if we want to imagine the possibility of a society without racism, it has to be a society without prisons, without the kind of policing that we experience today. I think that different frameworks, perhaps restorative justice frameworks, need to be invoked in order to begin to imagine a society that is secure. I think that security is a main issue, but not the kind of security that is based on policing and incarceration. Perhaps transformative justice provides a framework for imagining a very different kind of security in the future. So then the last question of this chapter by Frank is, you've been an activist for decades. What keeps you going? Do you think we should remain optimistic about the future? Then Frank said, Angela say, well, I don't think we have any alternative other than remaining optimistic. Optimism is an absolute necessity, even if it's only optimism with a will, as Rimsky said, and pessimism of the intellect. What has kept me going has been the development of new modes of community. I don't know whether I would have survived had not movements survived, had not communities of resistance, communities of struggle survived. So whatever I'm doing, I always feel myself directly connected to these communities, and I think that there is an era. Where we have to encourage the sense of community particularity at a time when neoliberalism attempts to force people to think of themselves only in individual terms and not in collective terms. It is in collectives that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism. And that concludes chapter 3. I think this next chapter is different. It's not done in an interview format. I think it's done more in a speech. This is a speech that Angela Davis had done. Okay. Oh, my fault. I went too far. Yes. This is a speech that Angela had done, and this is a speech at SOAS in London, December 13th, 2013. So this was 8 years ago. Just about 8 years ago. Chapter 4. Oh no. Oh no. Get these spiders out of here. Look, okay, my fault. Chapter 4. On Palestine. Chapter 4 is titled On Palestine, G4S, and the prison industrial complex. Again, this is a speech that Angela Davis had done in London. When this event highlighting the importance of boycotting the Transnational Security Corporation G4S was organized, we could not have known that it would coincide with the death and memorialization of Nelson Mandela. As I reflect on the legacies of the struggle we associate with Mandela, I cannot help but recall the struggles that helped to forego the victory of his freedom, and thus the arena on which South Africa apartheid was dismantled. Therefore, I remember Ruth First and Joe Slovo, Walter and Albertina Sisula, Govan Bekti, Oliver Ambo, and Chris Hani, and so many others who are no longer with us. I apologize for getting the name wrong. I apologize. In keeping with Mandela's insistence of always locating himself within the context of collective struggle, it is fitting to evoke the names of a few of his comrades who played pivotal roles in the elimination of apartheid. While it is moving to witness the unanimous and continued outpouring of praise for Nelson Mandela, it is important to question the meaning of this sanctification. I know that he himself would have insisted on not being elevated as a single individual to a singular sainthood, but rather would have always claimed space for his comrades in the struggle, and in this way would have seriously challenged the process of sanctification. He was indeed extraordinary, but as an individual, he was especially remarkable because he railed against the individualism that would single him out at the expense of those who were always at his side. His profound individuality resided precisely in his critical refusal to embrace the individualism that is a central ideological component of neoliberalism. I therefore want to take the opportunity to thank the countless numbers of people here in the UK, including the many then exiled members of the ANC and the South African Communist Party, who built a powerful and exemplary anti-apartheid movement in this country. Having traveled here on numerous occasions during the 1970s and 1980s to participate in anti-apartheid events, I thank the women and men who were as unwavering in their commitment to freedom as was Nelson Mandela. Participation in such solidarity movements here in the UK was as central to my own political formation as was the movements that saved my life. As I mourn the passing of Nelson Mandela, I offer my deep gratitude to all of those who kept the anti-apartheid struggle alive for so many decades, for all the decades that it took to finally rid the world of the racism and repression associated with the system of apartheid. And I evoke the spirit of the South African Constitution in its opposition to racism and anti-Semitism, as well as to sexism and homophobia. This is the context within which I join with you once more to intensify campaigns against another regime of apartheid and in solidarity with the struggles of the Palestinian people. As Nelson Mandela said, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Mandela's political emergence occurred within the context of an internationalism that always urged us to make connections among freedom struggles. Between the black struggle in the southern United States and the African liberation movements conducted by the ANC in South Africa, the MPLA in Angola, and the SWAPO and the FRELIMO in Mozambique, and PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, in Cape Verde. My good names, my fault. These international solidarities were not only among people of African descent, but with Asian and Latin American struggles as well, including ongoing solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and solidarity with the people struggling against U.S. military aggression in Vietnam. A half-century later, we have inherited the legacies of those solidarities. However well or however badly specific struggles may have concluded, as what has produced hope and inspiration and helped to create real conditions to move forward. We are now confronted with the task of assisting our sisters and brothers in Palestine as they battle against Israeli apartheid today. Their struggles have many similarities with those against South African apartheid. One of the most salient being the ideological condemnation of their freedom efforts under the rubric of terrorism. I understand that there is evidence indicating historical I understand that there is evidence indicating historical collaboration between the CIA and the South African apartheid government. In fact, it appears that it was a CIA agent who gave SA authorities the location of Nelson Mandela's whereabouts in 1962, leading directly to his capture and imprisonment. It was not until the year 2008, only 5 years ago, that Mandela's name was taken off the terrorist watch list. When George W. Bush signed a bill that finally removed him and other members of the ANC from the list. In other words, when Mandela visited the U.S. after his release in 1990, and when he later visited as South Africa's president, he was still on the terrorist list, and the requirement that he be banned from the U.S. had to be expressively waived. The point I am making is that for a very long time, Mandela and his comrades shared the same status as numerous Palestinian leaders and activists today. And that just as the U.S. explicitly collaborated with the SA apartheid government, it continues to support the Israeli occupation of Palestine, currently in the form of over $8.5 million a day in military aid. We need to let the Obama administration know that the world knows how deeply the U.S. is implicated in the occupation. It is an honor to participate in this meeting, especially as one of the members of the International Political Prisoners Committee, calling for the freedom of Palestinian political prisoners, recently formed in Cape Town. And also as a member of the jury of the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. I would like to thank War on Want for sponsoring this meeting, and progressive students, faculty, and workers at SOAS for making it possible for us to be here this evening. This evening's gathering specifically focuses on the importance of expanding the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement called for by the Palestinian civil society, which has been crafted along the lines of the powerful model of the anti-apartheid movement with respect to South Africa. While there are numerous transnational corporations have been identified as targets of the boycott, Viola, Veolia, for example, as well as SodaStream, Ahava, Caterpillar, and Hewlett-Packard, as well as others, we are focusing our attention this evening on G4S. G4S is especially important because it G4S is especially important because it participates directly and blatantly in the maintenance and reproduction of repressive apparatuses in Palestine. Prisons, checkpoints, the apartheid wall, to name only a few examples. G4S represents the growing insistence on what is called security under the neoliberal state and ideologies of security that bolster assholes. My fault there. I'm gonna let that throw me off. Under the neoliberal state and ideologies of security that bolster not only the privatization of security, but the privatization of imprisonment and the privatization of warfare, as well as the privatization of healthcare and education. G4S is responsible for the repressive treatment of political prisoners inside Israel through Adamir, directed by Sahir Francis. We have learned that the terrifying universe of torture and imprisonment, which is faced by so many Palestinians, but also about their hunger strikes and other forms of resistance. G4S is the third. My fault. I thought I had a yawn coming up, but I don't. G4S is the third largest private corporation in the world, behind Walmart, which is the largest, and Foxconn, the second largest. On the G4S website, one discovers that the company represents itself as capable of providing protection for a broad range of people and property, from rock stars and sports stars to ensuring that travelers have a safe and pleasant experience in ports and airports around the world, to secure detention and escorting people who are not lawfully entitled to remain in a country. In more ways than you might realize, the website reads, G4S is securing your world. We might add that in more ways we realize that in more ways, my fault. Let me start that over. My fault. We might add that in more ways than we realize, G4S has insinuated itself into our lives under the guise of security in the security state. From the Palestinian experience of political incarceration and torture to racist technologies of separation and apartheid, from the wall in Israel to prison-like schools in the U.S. and the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. G4S Israel has brought sophisticated technologies of control to Hasharon prison, which includes children among its detainees, and the Damon prison, which incarcerates women. Against this backdrop, let us explore the deep involvement of G4S and the global prison industrial complex. Let me see. I am not only referring to the fact that the company owns and operates private prisons all over the world, but that it is helping to blur the boundary between schools and jails. In the U.S., schools in poor communities of color, communities of color are thoroughly entangled with the security state. So much so that sometimes we have a hard time distinguishing between schools and jails. Schools look like jails. Schools use the same technologies of detection as jails, and they sometimes use the same law enforcement officials. In the U.S., some elementary schools are actually patrolled by armed officers. As a matter of fact, a recent trend among school districts that cannot afford large security companies like G4S has been to offer guns and target practice to teachers. But G4S whose major proficiencies are related to security, is actually involved in the operation of schools. A website entitled Great Schools includes information on Central Pascal Girls Academy in Florida, which is represented as a small alternative public school. If you look at the facilities page on the G4S website, you will discover this entry. Central Pascal Girls Academy serves moderate risk females ages 13 to 18 who have been assessed as needing intensive mental health services. G4S indicates that they use excuse me. G4S indicates that they use gender responsive services, that they address sexual abuse and substance abuse, etc. While this may sound relatively innocuous, it is actually a striking example of the extent to which security has found its way into the educational system, and thus also the way education and incarceration have been linked under the sign of capitalist profit. This example also demonstrates that the reach of the prison industrial complex is far beyond prison. This company. Oh shit. Oh no. Spilled. Damn. This company that provides security for numerous agencies as well as rehabilitation services for young girls at risk in the United States, while operating private prisons in Europe, Africa, and Australia. They also provide equipment and services to Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank along the route of Israel's apartheid wall, as well as to the terminals from which Gaza is kept under continuous siege. G4S also provides goods and services to the Israeli police in the West Bank, while it offers security to private businesses and homes in illegal Israeli settlements in occupied Palestine. As private prison companies have long recognized, the most profitable sector of the prison industrial complex is immigrant detention and deportation. In the U.S., G4S provides transportation for deportees who are being ushered out of the U.S. into Mexico. This colluding with the increasingly repressive immigration practices inside the U.S. But it was here in the U.K. where one of the most egregious acts of repression took place in the course of transportation of an undocumented person. When I was in London during the month of October, speaking at Birkbeck School of Law, I spoke to Deborah Coles, co-director of the organization Inquest, about the case of Jimmy Mubanga, who died at the hands of G4S guards in the course of a deportation from the U.S. to Angola. Good morning. On a British Airways plane, handcuffed behind his back, Jimmy was forcibly pushed by G4S agents against his seat in order to prevent him. My fault. Let me start this over. On a British Airways plane, handcuffed behind his back, Jimmy was forcibly pushed by G4S agents against a seat in front of him in the prohibited carpet karaoke hole. I never heard of that one. Carpet karaoke hole. In order to prevent him from vocalizing his resistance. The use of such a term for a law enforcement... Am I not supposed to say that? What is that? I don't know, I'm sorry. I'm unfamiliar with this term. Carpet karaoke hole. The use of such a term for a law enforcement hole, albeit illegal, is quite astonishing. It indicates that the person subject to the hold is compelled to sink into the carpet, or in the case of Jimmy, into the upholstered seat in the front. Carpet karaoke. Into the upholstered seat in front, thus rendering his protest muffled and incomprehensible. As Jimmy was held for 40 minutes, no one intervened. By the time there was finally an attempt to offer him first aid, he was dead. Wow. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Damn, 40. I don't even got no type of commentary or nothing to say after that. I think I just need to take a pause and reflect on that. 40 minutes they held this man on this plane. And it said that by the time they tried to offer him first aid, he was dead already. Meaning they held him there for 40 minutes. And he wasn't alive for all them 40 minutes. They held this man in this hold after he was dead. For 40 minutes. Okay. I'm going to get back on. This appalling treatment of undocumented immigrants from the UK to the US compels us to wait. These buses are so loud. And dangerous, too. This appalling treatment of undocumented immigrants from the UK to the US compels us to make connections with Palestine and Palestinians who have been transformed into immigrants against their will. Indeed, into undocumented immigrants on their own ancestral land. I repeat, on their own land. G4S and similar companies provide the technical means. My fault. G4S and similar companies provide the technical means of forcibly transforming Palestinians into immigrants on their own land. As we know, G4S is involved in the operation of private prisons all over the world. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, COSATU. No, it's COSATU. Recently spoke out against G4S, which runs the Mangaung Correctional Center in the Free State. The occasion for their protest was a firing of approximately 300 members of police unions for staging a strike. Wow. According to the COSATU statement, G4S modus operandi is indicative of two of the most worrying aspects of neoliberal capitalism and Israeli apartheid: the ideology of security and the increasing privatization of what has been traditionally state-run sectors. Security, in this context, does not imply security for everyone, but rather when one looks at the major clients of G4S, banks, governments, corporations, etc., it becomes evident that when G4S says it is securing your world, as the company slogan goes, it's referring to a world of exploitation, repression, occupation, and racism. Then Angela say, when I traveled to Palestine 2 years ago with a delegation of indigenous and women of color scholars and activists, it was the first time the members of the delegation had actually visited Palestine. Most of us have been involved in Palestine solidarity work for many years, but we were all thoroughly shocked to discover that the repression associated with the Israeli settler colonialism was so evident and so blatant. The Israeli military made no attempt to conceal or even mitigate the character of the violence they inflicted on the Palestinian people. Gun-carrying military men and women, many extremely young. How you doing? My fault. Gun-carrying military men and women, many extremely young, were everywhere. The wall, the concrete, the razor wire everywhere conveyed the impression that we were already in prison. Before Palestinians are even arrested, they are already in prison. One misstep and one can be arrested and hauled off to prison. One can be transferred from an open-air prison to a closed-air prison. G4S clearly represents these carceral trajectories that are so obvious in Palestine, but also increasingly characterize the profit-driven moves of transnational corporations associated with a rise of mass incarceration in the U.S. and the world. On any given day, there are almost 2.5 million people in our country. I'm gonna wait for this. On any given day, there are almost 2.5 million people in our country's jails, prisons, and military prisons, as well as in jails in Indian country and immigration detention centers. It is a daily census, so it does not reflect the number of people who go through the system every week or every month or every year. The majority are people of color. The fastest growing sector consists of women of color. Many are queer or trans. As a matter of fact, trans people of color constitute the group most likely to be arrested and imprisoned. Racism provides the fuel for maintenance and reproduction and the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And so if we say abolish the prison industrial complex, as we do, we should also say abolish apartheid, and abolish the occupation of Palestine. In the United States, when we have described the segregation in the occupied Palestine that so clearly mirrors the historical apartheid of racism in the southern United States. Y'all have a good day. Y'all have a good day. And especially before black audiences, the response often is, why hasn't anyone told us? Why hasn't anyone told us about this before? Why hasn't anyone told us about the segregated highways leading from one settlement to the other? About pedestrian segregation regulated by signs, not entirely dissimilar from the signs associated with the Jim Crow South. Why hasn't anyone told us this before? Just as we say, never again, with respect to the fascism that produced the Holocaust, we should also say, never again, with respect to the apartheid in South Africa and in southern U.S. That means, first and foremost, that we have to expand and deepen our solidarity with the people of Palestine, people of all genders and sexualities, people inside and outside prison walls, inside and outside the apartheid wall. Boycott G4S, support BDS. Palestine will be free. Thank you. That is a conclusion of the speech. That's the end of chapter 4. And the next chapter, I think we got time. The next chapter is chapter 5, and it's also a speech. It's called Speech at Birkbeck University in October 25th of 2013. The chapter is called Closures and Continuities. This is how it starts off. Oh, this is a song? I'm not going to sing. I'm not no good singer or nothing. Okay, here we go. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we struggle so long. We must be free. We must be free. No, I'm not no good singer. No. The title of my talk is drawn from a freedom song that was repeatedly sung in the southern United States during the 20th century freedom movement. The other verses of that song evoke crying, sorrow, mourning, dying. They say freedom is a constant dying. It's a line in the song. They say freedom is a constant dying. We've died so long, we must be free. And I like the irony of the last line of each of the verses. We've struggled so long, we've cried so long, we've sorrowed so long, we've moaned so long, we've died so long, we must be free. We must be free. And of course, there's simultaneously resignation and promise in that line there. In that line, there is critique and inspiration. We must be free. We must be free. But are we really free? How you doing? Good morning. Okay, my fault. In 2007, I was invited by Baroness Lola Young to speak here in London on the occasion of the bicentennial. Let's start this over. In 2007, I was invited by Baroness Lola Young to speak here in London on the occasion of the bicentennial of the abolition of the slavery in the UK. I'm saying that word right. No. But at the last minute, I was unable to make the trip because my mother had passed on the day I was scheduled to leave for London. Serendipitously, this is also a year of major anniversaries in the U.S. that reflect on the history of the Black freedom struggle. So I've been asked to speak about the meaning of freedom in these I don't know. Year of the U.S. I have no idea of the U.S. Emancipation Proclamation during the 50th anniversary year of pivotal events in the 20th century Black freedom struggle in the United States. So let me begin by evoking some of the 50th anniversary events. This is the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he defended his decisions to organize in Birmingham, where he was accused of being an outside agitator. In this way, I am cognizant, he wrote, of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what is happening and what... let me start this over. I am cognizant, he wrote, of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And you are probably familiar with that quote. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And then he proceeds to evoke history. For more than 2 centuries, he wrote, for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We're also observing the 50th anniversary. We're also observing the 50th anniversary. No, my fault. We're also observing the 50th anniversary year of the Birmingham Children's Crusade. It may be so widely known that the success of the Birmingham campaign was possible because vast numbers of school children, girls and boys, at the beginning of May in 1963, faced police dogs and high-power hoses. Okay, let's see. Okay, we're experiencing some low battery right now. We'll keep going until... We'll keep going for a little bit longer. Their televised demonstrations, and incidentally, television was quite young, and it was really the first time that people outside the South had the opportunity to witness these demonstrations, revealed to the world the determination with which black people continue to struggle for freedom. 1963 was also the year of the March on Washington. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was attended by 250,000 people. At that time, it was the largest ever assembly in Washington. This past August, there were 2 marches in Washington, one of which was addressed by President Obama and Clinton, and the other by figures who represent themselves as current civil rights leaders. I won't go into their names. And there were a series of events that marked the 50th anniversary. Many people did not know which march to attend. I think one was on the 24th and one was on the 28th. But last month, in September, a number of events took place in Birmingham, Alabama, which, as you heard, is where I was born and where I grew up. These events observed the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the killing of 4 young black girls. The height of the observances was a bestowal of the highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, on the families of the 4 girls killed in the bombing. Wait for this. Although the sister of one of the girls, Sarah Collins, sister of Addie Mae Collins, did not die, she lost an eye and was severely injured, and to this day, she has received no official assistance for her medical bills. That is absolutely disgusting. I don't even got no type of words to describe other than that's disgusting. This girl was a victim of this bombing. And received no help, no type of assistance with her medical bills. What I fear about many of these observances is that they tend to enact historical closures. They are represented as historical high points on a road to ultimately triumphant democracy, one which can be displayed as a model for the world, one which perhaps deserves as justification for military incursions, including the increased use of drones in the so-called War on Terror, which has resulted in the killing of vast numbers of people, especially in Pakistan. Bus is so loud, dangerous. While criticizing the Obama administration for the increased use of drones, I must at the same time acknowledge his speech on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for its attempt to represent freedom struggles as unfinished, and for at least attempting to focus on continuities rather than closures. But invoking the old adage, I must say that actions really do speak louder than words. No one can deny the global popular culture is saturated with references to the 20th century Black freedom movement. We know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most widely known historical figures in the world. Inside the U.S., there are more than 900 streets named after Dr. King in 40 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. But it has been suggested by geographers who have studied these naming practices that they've been used to deflect attention from persisting social problems, the lack of education, housing, jobs, and the use of carceral strategies to conceal the continued presence of these problems. There are more than 900 streets named after Dr. King. But there are also 2.5 million people in U.S. jails, prisons, youth facilities, military prisons, and jails in the Indian country. Indian country. The population of these facilities constitutes 25% of the world's incarcerated population, as compared to 5% of the planet's population at large. 25% of the world's incarcerated population serves as fodder for a vast prison industrial complex. For a vast prison industrial complex with global so many of them. Let's see. 25% of the world's incarcerated population serves as fodder for a vast prison industrial complex with global dimensions that profits from strategies designed to hide social problems that have remained unaddressed since the era of slavery. Police violence and racist vigilante violence is at its height. The Trayvon Martin case in the U.S. recalls the Stephen Lawrence case here, but also Islamophobia violence is nurtured by histories of anti-black racist violence. There is simultaneously a saturated geographical presence of the culture of the Black freedom movement, and a lack of anything more than abstract knowledge about the movement. I would dare to say that most people who are familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King and the my fault, I thought I had to sneeze. Okay. I would dare to say that most people who are familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King and the vast majority of people in the world who are familiar with him, they know little more than the fact that he had a dream. And of course, all of us have dreams. That's a little funny. And as a matter of fact, the "I have a dream" speech is the most widely circulated of all of his. Relatively, few people are aware of the Riverside Church speech on Vietnam and the way he came to recognize the intersections and interconnections of the Black liberation movement and the campaign to end the war in Vietnam. Therefore, understandings of the 20th century freedom movement that help us cultivate more complicated ideas of the geographies and temporalities of freedom are suppressed. Dominant representations of the Black freedom movement are a discrete series of historical moments largely produced by the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. And somehow, although Martin Luther King Jr. himself began to emerge to prominence as a consequence of that boycott, he is seen as always the leader of the civil rights movement. Even though numbers of books, both scholarly and popular, have written on the role of women in the 1955 boycott, Dr. King, who was actually invited to be a spokesperson for a movement when he was entirely unknown, the movement had already formed. Dr. King remains the dominant figure. And I wonder, will we ever truly recognize the collective subject of history that was itself produced by radical organizing? Early on, during the 1930s and 40s, and I am referring to, for example, to an organization who is known as the SNUC, my fault, the SNW, my fault, the SNYC, which has largely been excised from the official historical record because some of its key leaders were communists. As Carol Boyce Davies has pointed out in her wonderful book on Claudia Jones, Left of Karl Marx, Claudia Jones was one of the leaders of the NYC. And I mentioned Jones because of her important work in the U.S., because she became a pivotal figure in the organizing of the Caribbean communities here in Britain, after she was arrested for the work she did in the U.S. and eventually deported. How can we counteract the representation of historical agents as powerful individuals, powerful male individuals, in order to reveal the part they played, for example, by black women, domestic workers, in the Black Freedom Movement? Regimes of racial segregation were not disestablished because of the work of leaders and presidents and legislators, but rather because of the fact that ordinary people adopted a critical stance in the way in which they perceived their relationship to reality. Social realities that may have appeared inalterable, impenetrable, came to be viewed as malleable and transformable. And people learned how to imagine what it might mean to live in a world that was not so exclusive, that was not so exclusively governed by the principle of white supremacy. This collective consciousness emerged within the context of social struggles. Orlando Patterson has argued that the very concept of freedom, which is held so dear throughout the West, which has inspired so many world historical revolutions, that very concept of freedom must have first been imagined by slaves. During the era of the 20th century Black Freedom Movement, the human beings whose predicament most approximated that of the slaves from whom they were descended from, were black women domestic workers. We're referring to women who cleaned house, who cooked, who were laundry women. As a matter of fact, during the 1950s, some 90% of all black women were domestic workers. And given the fact that the majority of people who rode the buses in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 were black domestic workers, why is it so difficult to imagine and acknowledge what must have been among these black women domestic workers, this amazing collective imagination of a future world without racial and gender and economic oppression? Even though we may not know the names of all these women who refused to ride the bus from poor Montgomery communities to affluent white communities in Montgomery, Alabama, it seems that we should at least acknowledge their collective accomplishments. That boycott would not have been successful without their refusal, without their critical refusal. And thus, a figure like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. might have never have emerged into prominence. Fannie Lou Hamer. Some of you may have studied the history of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. The U.S. Freedom Movement. You may have run across the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a sharecropper and a domestic worker. She was a timekeeper on a cotton plantation in the 1960s. And she emerged as a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC. And as a leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She said, "All my life I have been sick and tired. Now I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." In 1964, she achieved national prominence when she demanded that members of her Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was a racially integrated party, be seated at the National Democratic Party Convention at the expense of seats that were given to the all-white Democratic delegation. In many ways, she paved the way for Barack Obama. But that's another story. This is not only a year of 50th anniversary celebrations, but it is also the sequential, I have no idea, of the Emancipation Proclamation. Interestingly, excuse me. Let me drink some. Coconut water, a beautiful thing. Okay. Interestingly, unfortunately, we have not been called upon to. My fault. Damn. Okay, I'm good now. Interestingly, unfortunately, we have not been called upon to participate in any nationwide anniversary event. I remember when you were here, at least, you had the opportunity to celebrate the bicentennial of the abolition of slavery. And of course, I think your figure is Wilberforce, so we have to question the fact that a figure like Wilberforce would be symbiotic of the abolition of slavery here. But we haven't even been really asked to participate in major celebrations. Perhaps the closest we come to that was a popular film, Lincoln, which actually focuses on the effort to pass the 13th Amendment. The anniversary of that passage is coming up in 2 years. The historical significance of the Emancipation Proclamation is not so much that it enacted the emancipation of people of African descent. On the contrary, it was a military strategy. But if we examine the meaning of this historical moment, we must better be able to grasp the failures as well as the success of the emancipation. I have thought perhaps we were not asked to reflect on the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation because it's more chapters than I thought. There's more pages than I thought in this chapter. Okay, I'm gonna finish this page, the next, and we're gonna have to wrap it up for the time being. I have thought that perhaps we were not asked to set this over. I have thought that perhaps we were not asked to reflect on the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation because we might realize that we were never really emancipated. But anyway, at least we might be able to understand the dialects of emancipation. Because we still live with the popular myth that Lincoln freed the slaves, and that continues to be perpetuated in popular culture, even by the film Lincoln. Lincoln did not free slaves. We also live with the myth that the mid-20th century civil rights movement freed the second... We also live with the myth that the mid-20th century civil rights movement freed the second-class citizens. Civil rights, of course, constitutes an essential element of the freedom that was demanded at that time. But it is not the whole story. And maybe we'll get that later. Eric Foner, in his book called The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, wrote that, and I'm quoting. So this is a quote from this book. The Emancipation Proclamation is perhaps the most understood of the... Let me start this over. I don't want to get this wrong. The Emancipation Proclamation is perhaps the most Okay. I need some cocoa and water. No, it say, I don't know if you're gonna see it. I don't want to do no advertising. It say perfect for smoothies. I might have to try it one day. My fault. Okay. We're hydrated. Okay. Here we go. Again, this is a quote from a book called The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation is perhaps the most misunderstood of the documents that have shaped American history. Contrary to a legend, Lincoln did not free the nearly 4 million slaves with a stroke of a pen. It had no bearing on slaves in 4 border states, since they were not in rebellion. The proclamation also exempted certain parts of the Confederacy occupied by the Union. All told, it left perhaps 750,000 slaves in bondage. And of course, that's my fault. That's the end of the quote. And of course, popular narratives about the end of slavery produced by the pronouncing of the Emancipation document by Abraham Lincoln erased the agency of black people themselves. But there is something for which Lincoln should be applauded. I believe there is something for which Lincoln should be applauded, I believe. And it is that he was shrewd enough to know that the only hope of winning the Civil War resided in creating the opportunity for black people to fight for their own freedom. And that was the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. We're on page 70. Phone's about to die. Yeah, we can't read some more pages. Okay, but this has been Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of Movement by Angela Y. Davis. Excellent book so far. I'm excited. We're going to pick back up tomorrow. Maybe around this time. Maybe pick up sometime throughout the day. I'm not sure yet. But still an excellent book. And if, again, I probably should plug this. If you would like to borrow this book after it's done being read, or if you would like to borrow any other type of book, you're just looking for some education, you can come down here. We have plenty of books at free community library. So say the name Square, listen to little Mike Sego. Continue reading tomorrow.